thank you very much for inviting us to share our what we've been doing around our Civic University agreement. This is who we are. I'm Helen Featherstone. I'm the Head of Public Engagement at the University of Bath, and I'm here with my colleague Katrina. Katrina, did you want to just introduce yourself too?
Yeah, so my name's Katrina Kelly and I'm Head of Community Engagement for the University of Bath, so I work very closely with Helen.
Yeah, so quite interesting that we've got these two roles, and you may be interested in what those two roles mean and why we've got the titles that we have. Just to reiterate what Claire said as well, we are happy to share things. So if there's anything that we say that you want to dig into in a bit more detail, do ask questions in the chat or follow up with us afterwards. So we'd be absolutely delighted to go into more detail. What we're going to do is, as Paul said, we've got a wee bit longer. So we're going to cover what we've been doing around the Civic University Agreement as a piece of change work, and I'll start with that. And then Katrina's going to give us some detail on a specific project called Our Shared Future. And then depending on how the time goes and how many questions there are, I can also talk a little bit about one example of how we're thinking about our civic behaviours. So that's our plan for the next wee while. Please, as I said, do ask questions, do put things in the chat, and I'll be delighted to see, and myself and Katrina will be delighted to see what we can do. So I shall kick off then with a little bit about what we're doing around our Civic University Agreement. It might be worth just telling you a little bit about Bath before we get going, because I think sometimes it's useful to know a little bit about context, doesn't it? So, so the University of Bath is a mid-sized research-intensive university. We're in the southwest of England, and we're a campus university on the top of a hill in the World Heritage City of Bath. We are invisible to the city. If you come to Bath as a tourist, you would not know that there was not only one university but two universities within the city, which is quite interesting. So we've got another university as well, Bath Spa University, and we've been working really closely with them in terms of our Civic University Agreement work, and we have quite complementary research strengths. So we're largely sort of STEM, humanities, social sciences and management, while Bath Spa is sort of arts and culture focused. And just to give you a sense of sort of scale, the City of Bath has about 100,000 residents, and the overall student population, we've got about 18.5, and Bath Spa has 8.5. So we're quite a significant proportion of the resident population. So that gives you a little bit of outline of what the University of Bath is. Where we were when we first got going on our Civic University Agreement, perhaps I could just have the slide up just for a moment, Shireen. So this is nothing new, right, to any of us. What the key message from this slide is that this stuff takes time. We first started talking about a Civic University Agreement in the January of 2019. So we're now nearly, where are we, 3 years on from that, come January next year. So that's quite interesting. And the reason I think it's interesting is that we've had a really fair wind. You know, so where the University of Bath was when we first started talking about this was that we were having a change of Vice Chancellor. So we were going from a Vice Chancellor who was less interested in the local and the civic to a new Vice Chancellor who was absolutely foregrounding that as a commitment. So that meant that our relationships between town and gown were perhaps not quite as positive as they could have been. We knew that there was staff and student desire to do more work locally and civically. And also we had a point where we also had my team, the public engagement unit. We'd been doing some change work around public engagement with research since 2012. So we had a really clear definition of what we meant by public engagement with research, and we could go on a kind of a working definition of what the distinction was between the civic work, which we see as an institutional endeavour, versus public engagement with research, which is a research endeavour and is delivered by our academic colleagues. So we had that sort of, yeah, like I say, a fair wind, you know, underneath our wings as we got going. And we also had the internal resource of myself and my team and Katrina. Now that is 3 full-time equivalent people, but we also, as well as creating the Civic University Agreement project and structure, we also have to deliver our ordinary core business as well. So it's not been a huge resource, but we've basically reallocated resources internally to make this stuff happen. So in terms of what we've done, perhaps we could have the slide up and I can just talk to that for a moment. So I think what's interesting, or what I found interesting reflecting back on this, was that we first suggested that we have a Civic University agreement before the new VC, Professor Ian White, before he even started, which was interesting because he came in with such this strong commitment to social, and he'd seen Queen's University Belfast social charter and wanted to have one of those, and we sort of knowing the relationship between the town and Gown, we were a bit like, we can't really do that. And actually, what would be better is if we do some really significant change work to really understand what civic work means for the University of Bath and for the region and for the partners. And actually, let's do this in a meaningful way, and let's produce something that's forward facing and based on evidence. So that was the case we made, and that was good. So that was accepted. So we've had quite a long process of sort of feeding in the idea of the CUA into the broader strategy and the local engagement strategy. So it's mine and Katrina's line manager who's responsible for the local engagement strategy and the civic work. Conducted a brief listening exercise. We did not have the resource to do a big region-wide consultation. There was no budget for that. So I basically phoned up some key stakeholders in the region and asked them what they thought about the university and what we should be doing and what their priorities were, so that we could see how we could fit into those. And what we found out there was that there'll be no surprises here. Now, bear in mind, this is pre-COVID, that people were concerned about the inclusive growth and economic development of the region. There's a lot of disparity within our region. Thinking about skills development and access to higher level qualifications, innovation and entrepreneurship, and how we can kind of deal with these sort of hidden disadvantages that are across the region. And the other thing that was interesting was that people expected us as an anchor institution to behave as a good citizen. So it was very clear that they wanted us to be a model organisation, as it were. And the other thing that was really loud and clear from that was that the people were delighted that we were reaching out, and they saw it very much as a clean slate opportunity. The change of the Vice Chancellor there were no hard feelings amongst the sort of potential partners across the region. This is the thing, this is quite an iterative process. Okay, so we then said we were going to create a Civic University agreement. We made a public commitment to that at a launch event of our shared future. And Katrina's going to talk about that in a bit more detail. We then went into a sort of bit more actually, what is this project going to look like? Now, we'd had a change project, as I say, when we set up with the public engagement unit. So we took some of the learning from that and pulled that into what we were going to do with this work. We thought it would be a bit quicker, a bit more light touch. So we took the core ideas from what we'd done before, saying, right, we need a central team that hold it. And we put an advisory group around them. And that advisory group covered all types of job families across the university. So we had academic colleagues as well as our sort of professional services colleagues. And the reason we wanted that was because we knew full well that actually if you want to create systemic change within an institution, you've got to change the way that the university does things. So we had HR, we've got HR on the advisory group, we've, talking to procurement, all these different parts of the university, estates and facilities, the sports training village, these bits of the university that also can take the idea of civic and put it into their own practice. So we went through a bit of a process of defining that structure with the University Executive Board, and the project formally kicked off in the summer of 2020 with the first advisory group meeting happening in September 2020. And we've since had 4 advisory group meetings. We've got our next one in next month, and that'll be the last one. Unsurprisingly, the pandemic kind of happened, and that unsurprisingly took the local authority and the local hospital, who were going to be our 2 key partners alongside the 2 universities, their priorities had to turn elsewhere. But so in a sense, COVID both helped and hindered. It helped in the sense that all of the core partners worked together really rapidly, really effectively. And so it demonstrated through a living, breathing process that we could work together on why that was so important. but it also meant that they had other priorities in terms of co-working on a Civic University agreement. So we decided to continue the internal work because we knew that we needed to change. And so we continued with the change stuff internally. And we're now at the point now where our partners, RUH Hospital and the local authority, are kind of available to breathe again. And they've come, and we're now at the point of actually beginning to draft and write the Civic University agreement. And just to sort of wrap up, really, in terms of what our advisory group has done, they've been really helpful. They helped us do a self-assessment. So we started off with the first thing using the EDGE tool, which some of you will be familiar with, which we'd used previously. And that told us that the reward and recognition was really needed a lot of work. So we could do some work on that quite quickly. The advisory group helped us think through who our partners should be and how we should incorporate them and the types of relationships we might have with them. We were able to do things like put a new category into our Vice Chancellor's Engage Awards for civic work. We explored what some of the themes might be for the work and how I might present them. We discussed the role of faith groups within this work, and we'd sort of mapped opportunities and looked at some specific interventions as well. In one in particular, Civic Duty Days, which I'll come back to later on if we have time. So I think perhaps the other thing that's just worth reflecting on is that Bath is a small city, a small region, and so the same senior staff kind of appear in each other's boards and groups and presentations, and there's a lot of like ongoing relationship. So while COVID was happening and there was all that focus on other things, actually everyone kept seeing each other, and so there was a lot of informal kind of talk about the CUA, about the Civic University Agreement. So it didn't kind of drop off a cliff, but it was just kept going. The conversations were able to be going. So when we actually got to a point where we could get around, obviously, still a virtual room with those senior leaders to say, here's what we're going to put in our Civic University Agreement, it was fine. That we didn't have to kind of pick up pieces, as it were. So I think, reflections are your starting conditions matter, but even a fair wind underneath your wings it's still going to take time, and like I think we heard with Claire and Jenny's project, it's people, and you've got to have that resource available to do this sort of work. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. We'll, Katrina, come to you in a second. Just Helen, there's a question from Claire about who did you engage with for feedback? We
already have a kind of business engagement part of the university that's already doing this sort of work. We didn't need to step into that. The desire for the skills development actually came through people like the colleges, the local colleges, voluntary services, the community development organisations that we worked with, because they quite rightly recognise that low aspiration and lack of education is something that hinders inclusive growth, which was absolutely a priority even before the pandemic happened. I'll need to go back and look at the exact people that I spoke with, but it was very kind of across the board, lots of different types of organisation, and actually the conversations with the advisory group, we've sort of flip-flopped a little bit with the business thing, because we've decided that actually the anchor organisation should be the anchor, the not-for-profits, but we recognise that there are big businesses within the region that play an important part. So how we've ended up sort of tentatively at the minute saying we have the core partners, Bath Spa University, University of Bath, RUH local authority, Baines, possibly, and then heading out perhaps towards a big charity called the St John's Foundation and the college, and the third sector groups, which you'll recognise the umbrella sort of voluntary and community services, and we'll keep them as the core partners, probably, and then other organisations who want to follow suit or want to kind of be supporters can be supporters, and that would be where some of those big businesses might come in. So we'll kind of that's the tentative, but we haven't got there yet, so that's our kind of working hypothesis. There's quite a lot of working hypothesis within our work.
But I think we're the same, but that's really that's just really interesting to have that confirmed, so thank you.
Thanks, Claire.
Great. Okay, well, let's go to Katrina now, who's going to talk about the Our Shared Future project that's nested within that overall picture. And please do keep using the chat. There's some great comments and questions coming through, so please keep that buzzing. And Katrina, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I'm going to give a bit of a sort of elevator pitch of what the Our Shared Future project is, and then we'll have a look at some of the challenges of getting it off the ground and the way it was structured. So as Helen said, we had a clean slate opportunity. This is back in December 2019, January 2020. We had a new Vice Chancellor. The local authority had a new head as well. And so where there had previously not been an extremely strong relationship, or really any relationship, there was a new desire to have one. So Our Shared Future is essentially the University of Bath's approach to how we work with our immediate local authority, which is Bath and North East Somerset Council. It essentially was started in, or launched, preconceived, but launched in January 2020. And from the outset, it focused on a number of core themes. So the first activity through Our Shared Future was a workshops of conference day, which brought together academics and people from the local council who were interested in particular subject areas. So a couple of themes were chosen so decarbonisation of the built environment, because 60%, I think 65% of the carbon in the Baines area comes from buildings. Transport and travel, which is a significant issue in what is a World Heritage City, with very small roads originally built for horse and cart. Development of the infrastructure of the city, and development of a cohesive and an inclusive city. So a link there to sort of online engagement of the local population. So through those workshops, a number of projects were identified that could happen, collaborative research projects between researchers at the university and local authority. But within weeks of that happening, we obviously had the onset of COVID-19, and the priorities of both organisations for a period of time were pulled in quite different directions. I struggle to really say whether COVID delayed Our Shared Future or enhanced it. I feel like the fact that we had that initial conversation and we'd brought key parties together made a huge difference to how we worked together throughout the pandemic, and our ability to work on a collaborative COVID response. So our students are a significant population in the local area. Understandably, residents had considerable worries about students coming in after the Christmas break from all over the world at a time when there was no testing and very little sort of clear idea about what restrictions actually needed to be in place and what the pandemic was going to look like. So us being able to work with the council, with public health, to contain and manage that situation, to support the students, to support local residents. In part, I feel that really cemented our relationship where it had previously been fairly weak, but it did take our focus away from those themes that we had identified for probably a period of about 6 months, while we dealt with the more pressing issues that were related to the pandemic. So the university took on things like making face shields and PPE for the local hospital with support from Baines local authority, and projects like that, which were more pressing in terms of their time. And then come sort of September 2020, we were able to sort of readdress and go back to those themes. And at that point, we realized that there was maybe some need for change. So within them, we decided the decarbonisation for the built environment was absolutely still key. The local authority has made a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030. The university's made similar commitments. And it is one of the biggest carbon issues in our local area. Transport and travel, again, because of that environmental aspect, was absolutely key. But the infrastructure and the cohesive and inclusive city elements were changed slightly to focus more broadly on health and well-being and access and enjoyment of and enhancement of green spaces across the local authority. So within those areas, we started 4 projects. which were aimed to they were collaborative research projects. They brought researchers together with people in the council to use pre-existing data in some cases, to collect new data in other cases, to try and tackle some of those challenges. So we had a team focused on decarbonising buildings. So they essentially undertook a project to set up a decarbonisation task force. They had a student team to create a vertically integrated project, which is multiple stages of students involved in carrying out research. And they're now seeking funding to build a larger project which will focus on decarbonising heritage sites right around the world. In the transport and travel theme, we had a student-led project which looked at introducing e-scooters to the city and is now looking at other transport-related issues. Under health and wellbeing, we've had an ongoing project looking at evaluating the Baines, the Bath and North East Somerset Compassionate Communities Hub, and is now looking wider at social prescribing. And under the green spaces element, we kicked off a project looking at the equity of access to green space across the city among different social groups and the challenges that are in place for some groups to reach and use green space for health and leisure and well-being. That then allowed, we put a structure in place to manage those projects, and through them we identified some of the challenges that existed in the two organisations working together. The main challenges were the sharing of data between the two organisations. Both organisations had differences in their data sharing agreements and in ethics policies. So that led to a programme of work between both organisations to streamline and align our data sharing and our ethics policies. And actually we extended that to include the local hospital, the RUH as well, because that allows the three large organisations in the city to work together with fewer barriers going forward. Another area that was identified as a challenge was getting funding. So to get these projects off the ground, we managed to get some QR funding, a bit of funding from the local LEP. We've recently got some national lottery heritage funding. And we're starting to find that the funding is the biggest challenge to getting these projects off the ground. So that led to us identifying different ways in which our staff at the university could work with staff at the local authority at different levels, so that everybody was really clear about what was available to them when they started a relationship. So obviously funded research where there's external funding to carry out a project. Acting as a critical friend, so academic staff from the university in most cases, sometimes professional services as well, giving a small amount of time pro bono to support projects that the council are doing, and vice versa, essentially giving input and advice and a sort of second pair of eyes. Student projects, so I mentioned our vertically integrated projects. There's projects that can last for a long period of time. Students can dip in and out of as part of their studies, either as a final year project or as a placement year, or just for interest. And so we've got a number of those going across different areas of work with the local authority now. But we're also now exploring things like student placement years and the like. And then finally is consultancy. So in a number of cases, especially in the COVID response, academics from the University of Bath acted in a consultancy capacity for the local authority, and us being able to coordinate that centrally and make connections for the local authority with relevant academics meant that that was something that was able to happen in a far more streamlined way than it had previously. In terms of the outcomes of the project, I would say overall, the main outcome is that there is now a regular open channel of dialogue between both organisations where there wasn't previously. The university is being actively approached by the local authority for its input on projects. So, for example, the local authority recently developed a shared vision for the city, and the university's input on that was absolutely key and very central to what was finally developed. The local authority has also set up an economic recovery board for post-COVID recovery, which the university has been asked to be part of the steering group for, and is again very central to the shaping of and the driving of. And I would say in terms of risks, some of the things that we sort of had to think about from the outset and try to mitigate for were challenges of, it's a two-university city, Bath. So us working collaboratively with the local authority couldn't be at the exclusion of Bath Spa University. Two universities are very different. They work with very different parts of the local community, because we have very different disciplines that we have expertise in. So making sure that we don't neglect to bring Bath Spa in where it is appropriate to do so on projects that we're working on. Making sure that we don't lose sight of the bigger picture whilst dealing with short-term issues. I say short-term issues, COVID hasn't turned out to be that short-term, but shorter term than, say, maybe climate change and some of the bigger challenges, social welfare, that the city faces. So trying to keep that longer-term picture at the time when a local authority is very focused on the day-to-day and the immediate pressures on them.
Perhaps I could just chip in. I'm conscious of time, so I won't go on for ages about this. But the other thing that we have been looking at is our civic duty days. Now, if I don't know if everyone's aware of these, but these are government requirement for organisations to let their staff do civic duties, and there's a list that's defined. I can pop the link in the chat. And we, as an institution, have long supported that, and most of us knew nothing about this when our HR contact said to us, why don't we use civic duty days to allow staff to do civic work? This was an absolute revelation to us. And it turns out the university had committed 10 days of paid leave to do civic duties. And we were like, this is amazing, but it's quite a tightly defined list. However, the university does have just this little sentence at the bottom that said, and other things to be agreed with your line manager. So we have been exploring about how to expand that to be much more purposeful, and that also will allow not just academics to be involved, but professional services staff as well. However, there's a whole narrative associated with that, which I don't think we've got time for today, but perhaps I could, if anyone's interested in that, I'm happy to share some thoughts around that in the future, or to come back and give a more detailed sort of presentation around that. But it's worth just knowing, that, and we knew that from our public engagement with research work, is that public engagement with research is done by our academic colleagues, and it's in the service of the kind of research, whereas the civic work is our institutional commitment, and that means the institution has to commit time and resource. But the senior management did panic a little bit, because they suddenly went, 3,000 staff all taking 10 days unpaid leave, that's going to affect the university business. And so we did have to kind of slow that down a little bit. We were hoping for a really easy win, and it's not been quite as easy as we were hoping for, but yeah.
And again, I think the timing of that as well, the fact that, we've just been through COVID, financial output it was not necessarily as clear as it maybe normally would. Forecasting isn't as clear. So I think that has an impact as well.
Yeah. Helen, just before we go, you tantalized us at the beginning by saying you might talk about civic behaviours, and we haven't got time to go into that in any detail, but I found that a really interesting notion. I wondered if you could just give us an elevator pitch about civic behaviours and how you're using that.
Thank you, Paul. Yes. So basically, when we're talking about civic behaviours, we're thinking about things like what we do with recruitment, what we do with procurement, how we use our estates and facilities, and think about our transport and travel. It's those types of things. So we've got these big, and if how we work can make significant change in the region, and if all of the anchor institutions also put in similar policies in place, for example, to prioritise recruiting, bringing in people who are at risk of long-term unemployment for work placements, for example, that's a HR initiative that has started as a result of the Civic University Agreement work. We've got a change in procurement policy now that incorporates a commitment to local, but that complements an existing, that just happened to be that the procurement policy was changing, and we're able to get that in. So that's the type of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about civic behaviour. So it's not about the kind of, what we've heard so far is about the kind of staff mobilisation to do stuff. It's about what we as an institution do. And I would put things like the civic duty days as part of that institutional behaviour, that it allocates and gives staff X days a year to do some stuff. So that's what I meant by that.
Yeah, and I'll pop a link in the chat in a minute, but a little while ago we launched on the network site a what we called a civic recipe book, which
Yeah.
looked at about how lots of different universities were approaching their civic work, and we came up with a sort of categorization, which was civic behaviors on the one hand, which is that kind of underpinning processes about how you be as a good civic institution, and then civic knowledge building, which was where people were really integrating the civic into the kind of teaching and the research. So that people might find that quite helpful.
And we used that to inform those discussions, and that sort of so
great.
that was definitely part of our thinking, Paul. So that was really helpful. So
great, it's wonderful, isn't it? Wonderful to see this work just maturing and crystallizing and just becoming practical.